And he tells them, with a minimal amount of evidence, you can make an accurate prediction about the weather. But with a mountain of evidence, you can't see who I am. Jesus has been preparing his disciples for the time when he returns, for the time when he returns back into the world to cast judgment on the world, to take an account of every soul that has ever existed. In fact, since Luke chapter 9, Jesus has been preparing his disciples for the fact that he's about to be betrayed. He's going to be crucified. He's handed over into the hands of lawless men, and he's going to be crucified, and then he's going to be raised from the dead. And then as we see chapter 12 unfolding, he begins to explain to his disciples that after he ascends into heaven, he's going to come back. And when the master returns, what does he do? He immediately takes an account of his household, whether he returns in the second watch or the third watch, late at the night or early in the morning, when no one expects him. He's going to take an account of his servants and how they have managed his house. So they need to be ready when he returns. They need to be prepared. And he's been instructing his disciples that he is going to bring judgment upon the earth. In fact, that's why he came. He said, I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring division. I came to cast fire on the earth, and would that it would already be kindled. I wish it would happen now. We see that very, very passionate soul of Jesus crying out for God to judge sin and to deal with sin. Now he turns from the disciples, from addressing that small inner group of disciples, to the whole crowd. And he says this in verse 54 and verse 55. He also said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you say at once a shower is coming, and so it happens. When people in Judea and Israel would look to the west and then look out towards the Mediterranean Sea and they see those clouds start to boil, what do they say? Well, the rain's coming. The precipitation is coming up. That cloud's coming over me. And they don't even have to know the scientific terms. All they have to do is be a human being with a little bit of experience in life. And they can tell that a cloud is going to bring rain. So you look to the west and you say, it's going to rain. Sure enough, the showers come. And when you see the south wind, verse 55, when you see the south wind blowing, you say there will be scorching heat, and it happens. When you turn to the south and you feel that wind start to blow, and you're in Judea and you're in Israel, you feel that wind start to blow off the Arabian desert. And you feel that warmness, you feel that heat starting to come, and you know it's about to get hot. A warm front is about to blow in. And with a minimal amount of evidence, you can make an accurate determination concerning the weather. So you're responsible for the things that you can observe. You're responsible for the things that you can observe. Notice very quickly at the very first of verse 54. He also said to the crowds. He goes from addressing that small group of disciples to addressing the crowds as a whole. The crowds as a whole. And it's because of this. No one is exempt from the evidence around them. You can write that down. No one is exempt from the evidence that is around them. He says, look, you take a minimal amount of evidence. You see a cloud over here in the west, and you see that it's coming. You know it's going to rain. You feel that south wind blow. You know that a warm front is coming in. With a minimal amount of evidence, you can make an accurate prediction about the weather. You're responsible for observing nature. You're responsible, and you are able to understand the world around you to a degree that you can understand what's going to happen, what's going to come about. It just takes somebody who's willing, really, to observe the weather, to observe what's going to happen. We feel that north wind coming. What do we say? It's going to start getting cold out here. We feel that south wind blow. We say it's going to get warm around here. We see the clouds boiling over the Gulf, over Sabine Lake. What do we say? Here comes another thunderstorm. It's going to rain. With a minimal amount of evidence, we can make accurate predictions about the weather around us. Now look at verse 56. He says, "You hypocrites, you liars, you lie against yourself. You lie against your own intelligence. You lie against what you know is right. You lie against your ability to observe. You prove that you can observe the weather around you. You prove that you can read signs. You prove that you can discern the world around you." So he says, "You hypocrites, you liars, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time?" This crowd in particular is staring at Jesus. They're following him, trying to figure out who he is. And he tells them, with a minimal amount of evidence, you can make an accurate prediction about the weather. But with a mountain of evidence, you can't see who I am. You're a liar. You lie to yourself if you say that you can't see God before you. He tells them, who else have you seen raise the dead to life? Who else have you seen turn water into wine? Who else have you heard of walking on water? Who else have you heard of feeding 5, 10, 15,000 people at a time from a few scraps of food? Who else have you seen heal a leprous man? Who else have you seen raise a paralytic from his bed and that same man leap and jump and dance for joy? Who else? There is a mountain of evidence before these people that Jesus is not just a good teacher, he is God. And he says, look, you see a rain cloud coming and you say it's going to rain. A minimal amount of evidence, you can make an accurate prediction. But this mountain of evidence before you, and you can't even see God. Folks, the same is true for us. The same is true for us. All around us is evidence of God. All around us is the evidence of his power, of his creative ability, of his designing, of his providential care. All around us is evidence. And if you don't see it, it's not because you can't see it, it's because you won't see it. Some of you, before I ever make this argument for the existence of God and his right to rule over you, before I ever make this argument, you have already determined in your heart that you will not acknowledge what I'm about to say. You will disagree with it no matter how reasonable it is. You'll disagree with it. It's not because you can't see God, it's because you refuse to see God. It's because you won't see God. I want to read a passage for you out of Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, verse 18 through 20. The Apostle Paul talks about this very thing. He says, "For the wrath of God, the anger, the burning anger of God, is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness," what? Not can't see the truth. He says, by their unrighteousness, they suppress the truth. They hide the truth. They take their hands and cover their eyes so that they can't see God. Verse 19, "For what can be known about God is plain to them." It is obvious to all of us what can be known about God because God has shown it to them. Verse 20 of Romans 1, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, having been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." If you are able, you have the intelligence enough to see rain clouds and predict rain. I'll say this. If you knew somebody that could look at rain clouds and not make any prediction about the weather at all and say, "I don't know what that means," you would say there's something wrong. All you have to have is a modicum of intelligence. just a couple of bits of intelligence to put that together. A plus B equals C. And you know it's going to rain. Folks, we can look around us in all of the world and we can see that this world does not just exist out of chance. Number one, you and I have never seen something come from nothing. Verify that for me scientifically. Someone had to make this stuff that we see. You know that God exists. You know that He is powerful. You know that He is personal. You know that He is intelligent by looking at the design of the world. All you have to do is play one game of Yahtzee. One game of Yahtzee. How many of you roll Yahtzee every time? Nobody. You know why? Because it's really hard to get those kind of odds. In fact, it's impossible. You say that about a game of Yahtzee, and yet millions of people say, yeah, this is chance. This is happenstance. Nobody in this room would walk into a wheat field, see a brand new F-150 and say, that grew out of the ground. Why? It's too complicated. It's too sophisticated. You can see design. And because you can see complication, you know that there had to be intelligence to design it. Because you see design, you know that there had to be a designer. When you look at a painting, you know there had to be a painter. When you look at creation, you know there had to be a creator. The evidence is all around us. You look at a human being. You and I, we don't happen by chance. There is no chance in our existence. We don't just come to be at the roll of a dice. It doesn't happen. The way your organs are so different and yet work so harmoniously together, and they are intricately dependent upon one another, is what's called irreducible complexity. Which means those parts can't function on their own. They can't evolve on their own and then come together and function. They had to have been made just the way they are, just like the way that a watch works. Nobody walks up on the street, sees a beautiful grandfather clock or a watch on the ground, and they pick it up. They never say, oh, that was cool. I don't know how that happened. They see design because all of these wheels depend on each other. All of these clicks and ticks and buttons and movements. It doesn't just happen. It's irreducibly complex. The evidence is around us. It's all around us. If you can't see God, it's not because you can't. It's because you won't. It's because you refuse to see Him. If you have the intelligence to see rain clouds and say rain, you have the intelligence to look in the mirror or look at creation and say, there is a God. And because He has created, creation is His. And because He has made me, I am responsible to Him. Just as everything that I own is responsible to me. You don't have to be brilliant to understand that. You don't have to be a scientist. All you have to do is be a human. All you have to do is be who God made you to be. And you can see the evidence of God. If you can't see God, it's because you won't. It's not because you can't. It's because you suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And I would invite you this morning in a very non-combative way just to open your mind, open your heart, and admit the fact that you already know that God exists. Admit that. Jesus says you can look at the rain clouds and you know rain's coming. You feel that south wind and you know that it's going to be hot. So why can't you interpret or discern or understand the time that you're living in? Don't you see God before you? Don't you hear the message of Jesus before you? Don't you hear the message of John the Baptist? Repent, for the kingdom of God is at heaven. Repent, for God has come here to judge sin. Can you see all the things that God is doing? Can you interpret the present time? And what I'd ask you this morning, we live in a different time than Jesus did. But Jesus says the same thing to us. Can you interpret the present time? Do you understand the day that you live in? Or are you so inoculated with entertainment? Are you so drunk with TV and radio and magazines and video games that you can't open your eyes and see the world around you and see what is going on? Do you feel the weight of what's going on in this world right now? We talk about the Holocaust of World War II and the Nazi state and communist Russia. We talk about all these things. And they're catastrophic, right? Millions of people killed. Genocide. People en masse being gassed. Funeral pyres stacked high and burning, and their smoke ascending into heaven. And we say that was a terrible time in the world. The worst. And yet, since 1973, the passage of Roe v. Wade, nearly 58 million, you got that number? We talk about the Holocaust, and there were 6 million Jews. 6 million. Since 1973, nearly almost 58 million babies have been, catch this, legally murdered in the United States. Legally. Do you realize since 2003, 37 states in the United States have officially condoned, supported, propped up, and propagated homosexuality? Since 2003, 37 out of the 50 states have adopted homosexuality. Do you understand the present time that we live in? I heard someone once say this, that if God doesn't destroy America, He owes Sodom and Gomorrah an apology. Do you understand the times that we live in? 58 million babies legally murdered, homosexuality condoned and praised by the world at large. Vulgarity and sexuality are prominent in the world. In fact, that is the staple of entertainment and advertisement. You cannot turn on the TV without hearing something vulgar, without seeing something sexual. You can't even look at a piece of advertisement without seeing somebody half-dressed or cursing and being filthy. Sex before marriage, sex out of marriage, it's just the way life is. It's just the way people are. Promiscuity is prominent. It is praised in this world. And do we think for a second that God is okay with that? He wasn't okay with Sodom and Gomorrah. Why on earth would He be okay with America? He's not. God's not happy with what's going on in this world. And if we're able to look at the clouds and see rain coming, we ought to be able to discern the time we live in and understand that catastrophe is about to hit. It's about to strike, and it's going to come from God's hand. I want to read a quote, an old quote for you from a great man, a great teacher, who talked about this day that was going to come. Listen to this man. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. You know who I'm talking about now? And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will increase, the hearts of many will grow cold. Sounds like a pretty accurate description of the present time to me. Jesus said that in the Gospel of Matthew 2,000 years ago about this present day. And all of these warnings, all of these things that He's saying are happening. These are precursors to the coming of Jesus. These are precursors to the master returning from the wedding feast and taking account of his servants. If you open your eyes and you see the world that we live in, you know that these last days are upon us. Judgment cometh nigh. So in light of the coming judgment of God, it would be wise, or as one of my old coaches said, it would behoove you to reconcile with God beforehand. Because you know the coming judgment of God, it would be wise to reconcile with Him before we get there. Reconcile with Him on the way, in fact. Look at verse 57. Jesus says, "And why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? As you go with your accuser before the magistrate," don't you know that's where we're going? All the things that we've done wrong, we're going to meet our Maker, or He's coming to meet us, one way or the other. That's our destination. As you go with your accuser, your legal adversary, before the magistrate, the ruler, make an effort to settle with him on the way, lest he drag you to the judge, and the judge hands you over to the officer, and the officer puts you in prison. I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the very last penny. Jesus says that in light of the coming judgment, it would be wise to reconcile with God on the way. If you don't reconcile with God on the way, then you'll just stand before a judge. You'll stand before someone who will take an account of everything that you've done, all the ways that you've lived your life. And I want you to notice in verse 58, the beginning of verse 58 says that there's grace on the way. There's the opportunity for reconciliation on the way to God, on the way to the judge. There's opportunity for peace. You can come to Jesus and say, "Jesus, before we get there, before that day comes, I want to be made right with you. I want to turn my life around. I want to follow you. I want peace with you. I want peace with God." Jesus says, do that. Settle with Him on the way. But verse 59 tells us that though there's grace on the way, there's only judgment in the end. So if you don't reconcile with God on the way to that day, you'll only receive what is due to you. We talk about justice all the time as if it's something we actually want. Really, we don't want justice for ourselves, do we? We want justice for everybody else. We want this person to pay for their sins, that person to pay for their crimes. But we're okay with ours being hidden. We're okay with our sins being swept under the rug. You realize that if God gave us justice right now, we would all be in hell. We would all suffer as criminals, the sinners that we are. Folks, we don't want justice. We don't want to stand before God and Him give us what we are due. But some people, many people in this world, they point their bony, rebellious finger at God and they say, "When I meet you, I'm going to tell you what I think." What Jesus says in 58 and 59 is, you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that because you're going in handcuffed. You're being taken by a ruler before the judge. He's going to sentence you, and then one of his officers is going to take you away, and you will pay every last penny of what you owe God. So if you want justice, if you want what's coming to you, you can have that. It really is your choice. You can have that. But if you're reasonable, that's not what you want. It's really not. Jesus says, settle with your accuser on the way. Either seek reconciliation now or receive judgment in the end. Either receive reconciliation now or judgment in the end. Now, many disasters, many catastrophes can be avoided, can't they? If we would just read the signs, if we would just see the signs about us, if we would just look around, we could see the signs of coming disaster, of coming catastrophe. There were signs that the housing market was going to crash. There have been signs every time the stock market is going to crash. The winds pick up every time there's going to be a tornado. Hail comes before that twister comes. No, so we see these signs, and catastrophe can be avoided. But some people, despite warnings, despite signs, they ignore it, and they just take on catastrophe headlong. Just ignore it. Inoculated with life. Inoculated with making money, with taking care of the here and now. They're anxious about their life, what they'll eat, what they'll drink, what they'll wear. And they don't pay attention to the world around them. Here's an example that literally, geographically, hits close to home. In the early days of September in the year 1900, there were warnings starting to float around in Galveston. People started to say, hey, there's some high winds in Cuba. There's a tropical storm out here. The water in the Gulf is extremely hot. It just seems like ripe conditions for a bad storm. And things seem to be pointing that direction. Oh, but so many people say, you don't want to panic anybody. You don't want to warn anybody. Because if you warn them, they'll run. And there may be a few wrecks on the way. So just leave them where they are. Leave them happy with this life. Don't bother them. Don't panic them. So September 8th of 1900 comes around, and the most catastrophic natural disaster ever to hit the United States struck. And it ruined Galveston. They estimate that between 6,000 and 10,000 people were killed on that day. Nearly 8,000 people lost their lives, not because they didn't see the signs, but because they ignored the signs. Not because they couldn't see the truth, but because they refused to see the truth. And so many people said, don't warn them with the truth. Don't scare them with the truth. You may offend them. You may ruin their weekend at the beach. You may ruin their pleasure cruise. And because they did not heed the warnings, did not read the signs, 20% of the island's population lost their lives. Folks, we see warnings all around us. We see the signs of the times all around us. We judge that against history. We judge that against the promises of God. And only one thing can come. It's a hurricane of God's judgment. It is a catastrophe coming upon people who have not settled with God already. Maybe this morning you say, I hear this warning. I see my need. I need to be made right with God. Maybe you need to come forward. Maybe you need to come down here and you say, you know what? I'm going to follow Jesus for the rest of my life. I'm going to live for Him, and I'm going to avoid that judgment. I'm going to receive grace on the way, reconciliation on the way, because I can't bear judgment in the end. I don't want to pay every last penny for all the things that I've done wrong. Or maybe you've been made right with God already, and maybe you don't need to come this way. Maybe you need to go that way. Maybe there's somebody in this room whom you've wronged or who has wronged you, and you need to be reconciled to them before one of you perishes. Because when that day comes, there's no other opportunity. Either settle with them now or you don't get it settled. Maybe you need to respond that way. Maybe this morning you need to commit yourself to be bold to warn people, to be bold enough to talk about sin, to be bold enough to say that God is not happy with this world. He's not happy with the way things are going, and there will come a day, and it's sooner rather than later, that God will right every wrong. You must be reconciled with God. That's why the Apostle Paul tells us we are ministers of reconciliation, calling people to be reconciled with God. Maybe you need to ask the Lord for boldness today to do that, to live in light of the return of Jesus, and to warn people, to be that spokesman on the beach of Galveston, saying, get off the beach. Hurricane's coming. Maybe you need to be that person issuing that warning. whatever it is that you need to do to respond to the Lord this morning, I'd ask that you do it, that you would react. Have a reaction to what God has called you to do. Would you pray with me?